How do you do, folks? Bradley J Show. Guest is Rich Rubino. We try to do kind of one a week. Rich is a political genius, kind of, when it comes to political history, and he's an analyst and a speaker, and all. And he does speaking engagements. And today we're going to talk about why experience can hold you back when it comes to politics. I guess Rich's theory is that politics is the only job where experience can be a hindrance, and a person with no experience can take advantage of the no experience and get the job. That doesn't necessarily mean
Yep,
you can do the job, but we're talking about the getting the job part, correct?
absolutely.
All right. So this is kind of an essay question. One, two, three, go.
Yes, absolutely. It's fascinating. If you're looking for a brain surgeon, you're probably not going to be looking for somebody who says they're an outsider or they're not part of the brain surgeon and culture. If you're looking for a plumber, if you're looking for a lawyer, you're looking for just about any other field. But in politics, if somebody comes along and says, I'm an outsider, I'm not part of the Washington culture, it actually benefits them politically. On the same token, if someone comes out and they have a Harvard degree, they have Ivy League degrees, it's actually a liability because you're immediately seen as an elitist. If somebody comes in and doesn't have a degree, it actually benefits them. Now, I think this all goes back really, if you blame anyone about it, it really goes back to the inimitable William Henry Harrison. Now, you're all saying, who's William Henry Harrison? Well, he ran for president in 1840. He actually came from a patrician background. His father signed the Declaration of Independence. But here's what he essentially did. He tried to run that year as essentially the common man. He had so there was a newspaper reporter that was trying to be critical of him and said, all you have to do with William Henry Harrison is have him sit in his porch and give him sit in a log cabin, sit in the porch of a log cabin rather, and give him some whiskey. So William Henry Harrison's handlers came up with the idea for the modern campaign. And the modern campaign was to make Harrison the common man. They had him dressed down, and they literally made these whiskey-shaped bottles, and a guy named Booze actually sponsored them, and they put liquor in it, and that's where the word booze came from, to show that he lived in a log cabin. Now, he lived there about a year after he was in the military, so it was very disingenuous, but they essentially did that. Now, they did other things, too. They had a ball that they would go from all the rallies, go from one end to the other, or go from one city to the other. They'll keep the ball rolling. So that was basically what their platform was, and ever since then, almost every candidate who does not have political experience, or even who does have political experience, pretends that they don't. And politicians that have prestigious education oftentimes pretend that they don't. So you go all the way to say just more recently, for example, in 1974, there was a Harris poll of the 35 potential candidates who would challenge Gerald Ford as Gerald Ford is a Republican, as the Democratic presidential nominee. And the outgoing governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, was literally not on there. He was an unknown politically. So how did Jimmy Carter go from an unknown politically to essentially leapfrogging establishment candidates? You had candidates like Scoop Jackson, who'd been a member of the House, a member of the Senate, chairman of the Natural Resources Committee. He'd been the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. He was arguably JFK's first choice as running mate in 1962. 1960, you had Birch Bayh, United States Senator, George Wallace, longtime governor, Fred Harris, longtime senator from Oklahoma, Lloyd Bentsen, very much an establishment candidate from Texas, and many other candidates. But Robert Byrd was running as a favorite son candidate. So why Jimmy Carter? Because this was right after Vietnam, right after Watergate, and there were committee hearings showing that the CIA had essentially plotted coups against other countries like Iran, Venezuela, and Guatemala, and there was this distrust all over the country for politicians. So Jimmy Carter comes out and says essentially, look, I'm a naval aviator. I have a degree from the Naval Academy. I was a businessman, meaning he was a peanut farmer, and he only served one term as governor of Georgia. At the time, he couldn't serve consecutive terms. So he runs as an outsider. And all these other candidates, Birch Bayh says the bloom's going to go off the roses and people are going to figure out who Jimmy Carter really is. Well, people tended to like Jimmy Carter. He would go into, at one point he goes into a store and he introduced himself, and the guy, he says, I'm Jimmy Carter. The guy says, Jimmy who? And actually kind of used that to his advantage to show how un-Washingtonian he was. So in Iowa, he came in second to uncommitted, wins New Hampshire, goes on to Florida eventually, and beats George Wallace, set to prove a Southern candidate other than George Wallace can win in Florida. Goes on to win the nomination. And toward the end of the campaign, the establishment of the Democratic Party is saying, I can't believe this guy could actually garner the nomination. So Frank Church, who had led all these committee hearings about the CIA, he gets into the race as a Stop Carter movement. Jerry Brown, who'd just been elected governor of California 2 years earlier, gets in as an emergency candidate for the establishment of the Democratic Party. But you know what? The Democratic rank and file voters wanted somebody who was outside of the establishment and did not have Washington experience. So he eventually lands up garnering the presidential nomination in 1976. Then you get the general election. You get Jerry Ford, 25 years in the United States Congress, minority leader of his party, and then vice president and president. So when they asked Jimmy Carter about Gerald Ford's experience, he would say, well, I'm untainted by Washington, meaning that Ford was part of the problem essentially because he was part of Washington. So Jimmy Carter lands up winning, and then everyone likes outsiders. Ronald Reagan, 4 years later, comes in and defeats Jimmy Carter, but he wins the Republican primary in part by running against the quote-unquote insiders in Washington. He runs against folks like George H.W. Bush. He runs against Howard Baker, all Washington establishment-type candidates. And you can fast forward to, modern times. Bill Clinton in 1992 garnered the Democratic nomination in part by talking about the brain-dead policies of both parties. And he beat some, United States senators like Tom Harkin and certainly Bob Kerrey. And then here's where the experience part comes in. I talk about this with Barack Obama and George W. Bush. That's interesting. Here's a big commonality between them. Two of them. One of them, they both once ran against Alan Keyes. And when Bush first met Obama, the first thing Bush said to him is, we have something in common. Obama said, what's that? He said, we both beat Alan Keyes. And he said, boy, that guy was quite a piece of work, wasn't he? But if you look at it politically, experience-wise, here's where they have a lot in common. 1978, an open seat opens up in West Texas, and George W. Bush, fresh out of Harvard Business School, then before that, Yale, Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. So basically a prep school kid who grew up in New England, runs for that open seat, wins the Republican nomination, and then the Democratic nominee, Kent Hance, uses his experience against him. He says, my daddy was a farmer. Your daddy was part of the Washington culture. And this is what Kent Hance said also. He said, Texas Tech plays better in the 19th Congressional District than Harvard and Yale. And George W. Bush had no response to that, and he landed up losing, and he also was called a phony Texan by Kent Hance. And after that, he said, I'm never going to be out-Texaned again. So he developed a little bit of a Texas twang and kind of ran against his lineage. Now, Barack Obama gets elected to a state Senate seat in 1996. In 2000, he runs for a House seat against an incumbent, Bobby Rush. And Bobby Rush defeats him by 31 points. And in that race, Bobby Rush basically excoriated Obama, and he said, he called Obama, quote unquote, an educated fool. He called him an educated fool, and he said, folks are not that impressed by these prestigious degrees. And it worked for him because they made the case that essentially here's this interloper who didn't grow up in the community, who wasn't part of the South Side of Chicago, running for a congressional seat against an incumbent, and it actually worked. So he ran essentially against his experience. And by 2008, when Obama himself ran for president, he did it right at the right time, by the way, because he had just been elected to the United States Senate, okay? And Hillary Clinton was the preponderant frontrunner. Harry Reid, Chuck Schumer, and members of the Democratic Party thought that Hillary Clinton would have problem winning in the general election. So they went to Barack Obama and they said, just consider running. And Obama would say, well, I just got elected to the Senate. I said I'd serve my full term. They said, if you serve longer, then essentially if you wait a little while, it's not going to help you because you're just going to rack up more and more votes and you're going to become more of an insider. They said, this is your time to run. And they were right. John Edwards ran that year as well in 2008. And Hillary Clinton had problems with both of them because they're both running as outsiders. Mm-hmm. If you look at candidates like Bill Richardson, Chris Dodd, Joe Biden, they had a lot more experience and they got nowhere in that race. Folks like Barack Obama and John Edwards rose right to the top.
Well, you're talking about a couple of things. Lack of experience in politics and lack of education. You're kind of lumping those together. Are they same? Are they seen the same way? Because I can see where some Ivy League education wouldn't even impress me. I don't care about that. But some level of experience. I mean, there are there's a lot to know. It's tough to get up to speed when you become president, which became evident from our previous president. He didn't seem to get what you're supposed to do. There were certain responsibilities, like read the security briefing or take the security briefing. Stuff like that. I don't care about the education. But I don't mind someone with at least some sort of executive experience. Maybe not DC executive experience, but being a governor would be good. And I would guess because of that governors tend to be better presidents than senators. Is that true?
Well, it's interesting, and obviously that's arbitrary. And Americans do tend to elect, at least contemporaneous times lately, they have been electing governors: Carter, Reagan, Clinton, George W. Bush. And if you look at United States senators, actually, when Obama was elected in 2008, he was only one of 3 incumbent senators in American history who went right to the presidency. Warren G. Harding in 1920, who also, by the way, was somebody who had very little experience. He was literally elected in 1914, the first year that it was constitutionally that United States senators were elected by the people, not by the state legislatures. He was elected in 1920 in part because he gave a speech in 1916 at the Republican National Convention, where actually coined the term founding fathers, got some name recognition. In Kennedy's case, Kennedy was first elected to the United States Senate in 1952, in part because his opponent, Republican Henry Cabot Lodge, was spending so much time campaigning for Eisenhower, he was ignoring essentially his own campaign. So he gets elected, then he gets reelected in 1958, and he had a relatively unastonishing Senate career. He said a lot of it was he was suffering from Addison's disease. He was spending a lot of time speaking around the country. So most United States senators kind of thought, like Lyndon Johnson, for example, who tried to run against him that year, and Hubert Humphrey, who tried to run against him in the Democratic primary, certainly had more experience. Johnson ran against him at the convention. Stuart Symington of Missouri ran at the convention as well. They both had a lot more experience. But Kennedy was seen as young, and he was seen as kind of an outsider. And it was a perfect year, 1960. He just came off a re-election bid in 1958, where he had very nominal opposition. So generally speaking, governors, though, it is a lot easier to get elected. In the case of Ronald Reagan, he tried it 3 times. Now, remember, he tried it in 1968, just 2 years after he was elected. So he gets elected in 1962, beats Democrat Pat Brown. In 1968, at the convention, he didn't participate in any of the primaries, but his name was thrown into contention as a possible presidential candidate. You had Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, Richard Nixon, the former vice president, and Nixon lands up winning. Then, so Reagan runs for re-election in 1970, wins re-election. 1974, he does not run for re-election. 1976, he runs against Gerald Ford in the Republican primary, comes this close to beating him. Then by 1980, runs again and runs as an outsider. Bill Clinton's an interesting example. So Bill Clinton gets elected Attorney General in 1976, governor in 1978. 1980, loses his re-election bid. At the time, Arkansas governors only had 2-year terms. Comes back in 1982, wins re-election again after a tough primary and a tough general. Wins in 1986 overwhelmingly. 1990 has a primary challenge, barely wins the primary, then wins the general election over Sheffield Nelson. So then in 1992, he essentially ran. But when he ran, by the way, he had made that promise when he ran for re-election as governor. They asked, would you serve out your full term? And he said, you bet. Then he goes on a listening tour after being reelected when it appears George H.W. Bush is extremely vulnerable. And then he says, the people of Arkansas think I can do more for them as president than as governor. And he gets in the race. And he got in the race at the opportune time, because that year, some of the most formidable candidates, Mario Cuomo, Lloyd Bentsen, Dick Gephardt, Jesse Jackson, Joe Biden, all did not get into that race, even though they desperately wanted to, in part because George H.W. Bush was so popular at one time. So Clinton announces on October 15th of 1991, he gets in that race, and he's seen as an outsider. He's running against candidates like Tom Harkin and Bob Kerrey, who were insiders. And Bill Clinton basically talks about the brain-dead politics of both parties. He loses New Hampshire, but he loses Iowa because Tom Harkin, it's his home state. He loses New Hampshire, next door state to Paul Tsongas. Goes to Georgia, gets Zell Miller, Ben Jones, and Sam Nunn all endorsing him. and he lands up winning in Georgia, goes on to the South, lands up winning. Now, George W. Bush, how did he do it? He obviously came from a political family, patrician background, but
he didn't sound like an academic, though.
But you know what? If you listen to him early on when he ran in that first congressional race, he did. He was able to de-Yale and de-Harvard himself. By the time he runs in 1994 for governor, he beats Ann Richards, an incumbent and very much a real quintessential Texan. Ann Richards had a 60% personal approval rating on election day, and Bush still beat her, partly because Bill Clinton was unpopular and partly because she was opposed. She was very much a supporter of many gun control measures. But he serves as governor, becomes a good old boy, works with Lieutenant Governor Bob Billick, who's very much a good old boy. In 1998, wins re-election with 68% of the vote, then goes in 2000 and talks essentially about how he's an outsider and how voices need to come from outside of Washington, how he's a passionate conservative. Now, John McCain had certainly had Washington experience that year. You had other candidates running that year as well. You had Orrin Hatch, who had a lot more experience. But George W. Bush basically ran as an outsider, ran as kind of a good old boy. And just like he did in Texas, he was able to pull it off. And Al Gore, who very much, I think, tried to dumb himself down a little bit, but I think he kind of failed in it in many respects. George W. Bush, it's interesting, despite the fact that he had that background, there are people in the middle of the country who really believed that George W. Bush was kind of their tribune. It was really kind of genius in a sense, the way he was able to do that. And then when he ran against John Kerry in 2004, John Kerry tried to do exactly what Bush did. He tried to essentially dumb himself down very much. One time he walked into a shop and he says, "This is where I can get me a hunting license." It just did not work for John Kerry because John Kerry could not work the persona the way George W. Bush somehow could.
We have a question. What outsiders in the Republican Party do you think might throw their hat in the ring for 2024?
Great question. This is where everyone's talking obviously about Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. And I would say that whoever the front runner is at this time does not mean, and I'm assuming by front runner, I mean front runner of the candidates other than Donald Trump. There are going to be a lot of other candidates that are going to run that a lot of people have never heard of. Asa Hutchinson, the governor of Arkansas, outgoing governor of Arkansas, is somebody who I think is going to run, somebody who I'd certainly watch is who's someone in between the Trumpers and the anti-Trumpers. Larry Hogan, the outgoing governor of Maryland, is very much a never-Trumper. He's somebody who did not even vote for him. He's somebody who's very critical of him. He's going to try to take that. He's going to try to say, I'm from outside of Washington. He's going to say that the Republican and Democratic parties are both kind of screwing things up. And he's going to say, I'm somebody from outside of Washington. Glenn Youngins is somebody who got elected last year. They have off-year elections in Virginia, the incumbent governor of Virginia. And he's very much going to try to take a Trump-type message without being Trump, a softer, gentler version, if you will, of Donald Trump. Now, Ron DeSantis was just reelected, and he was reelected by 19 points, and that was the biggest win of any Florida governor in the history of the state, partly because demographics are changing and the state's added 500,000 more Republican voters. But he's going to come in, and he's going to do just what George W. Bush did, just what Thomas E. Dewey did in 1948, and see, I'm somebody who's from outside of Washington, and he's going to talk about how we can essentially get the Trump economy without Donald Trump. He's going to say something like that. That's basically what his message is going to be. I think he's also probably going to use a model of a rose garden strategy. In other words, try to be governor of Florida and try to have many pronouncements, go out and talk about what he's doing, working with both houses of the legislature are now Republican. And he's going to use that to try to essentially get elected president of the United States. And there are going to be a litany of other candidates. Some insiders are probably going to run. Marco Rubio and Rick Scott, the two senators from Florida, are certainly probably going to consider running. I think that Bill Hurd, a former congressman from Texas, who's very anti-Trump, will consider running. Adam Kinzinger, congressman from Illinois, anti-Trump, and Lynn Cheney, congressman from Wyoming, too.
Could either of those last two get the nomination?
No. I mean, barring a cataclysm, no. I think that it's basically going to be either Donald Trump. My guess is, if best scenario for Donald Trump, 47 other people run. They all split the anti-Trump vote. Trump wins these states with 42% of the vote. The people that are very loyal to him garners the nomination. That's how he did it last time. He didn't win a single state until he got to his home state of New York. Because when he would win 40%. Everyone else would be splitting the anti-Trump vote. So I think it'd be very hard for it. I think the party whether it's Trump's the nominee or not the nominee, Trump's ideology is now predominant in the Republican Party. And somebody who's that anti-Trump as Larry Hogan is, I think it would have to be an absolute revolution in the party the way William Jennings Bryan was in 1896. And I don't see that happening.
Yeah. So I can sort of see Trumpism do well without the baggage of Trump, because the man, has a lot of baggage, and he's always accumulating more baggage. What would you say are the main tenets of Trumpism?
Yes.
One of them is, hey, we don't want to pay NATO anymore. We don't want to pay for European defense anymore. A strong immigration, a wall mentality on the southern border. What else?
Yeah, a couple things. Economic nationalism. This is one thing Trump has always stood apart from the Republican Party. Basically, from Eisenhower to Mitt Romney, every Republican Party nominee has been a free trader. Now, not necessarily an unadulterated free trader, but a free trader. Donald Trump is an economic nationalist who supports tariffs, who said NAFTA. He said this in the debate with Hillary Clinton. He said, your husband signed it, pointing to Bill Clinton, and said that was the worst trade, one of the worst agreements the United States has ever made, very much against NAFTA, which the Republican Party had helped Bill Clinton get through. Was Bob Dole, Newt Gingrich, and all the members of the House, Republican members of the House of Representatives who supported that. The Democratic side, it was Dick Gephardt, David Bonnier, Jesse Jackson, Jerry Brown, all opposed to it. So he's changed the position on free trade. Now you're a rhino if you're a free trader. On foreign intervention, you're talking about NATO. Basically, if you look at George W. Bush, he was an exponent of essentially ending tyranny in our world. And he literally said that in his 2005 inauguration address. He invaded 2 countries, Afghanistan and Iraq. Donald Trump, criticizing then former Florida Governor Jeb Bush in the primary, said that your brother made a huge mistake and over 1 million people died for it. He's basically somewhat of a non-interventionist. And immigration, George W. Bush wanted to essentially earn path to citizenship. Donald Trump essentially wants to curtail not only illegal immigration, but legal immigration. This is the same platform essentially that Pat Buchanan ran on in 1992 as an insurrectionist against the incumbent. He ran against George H.W. Bush. Essentially those same 3 platforms, ran again in 96, won in New Hampshire, and then the establishment consolidated on Senator Dole. But it's basically the Pat Buchanan bloodline of the Republican Party is now the establishment bloodline under Donald Trump.
All right. Reagan again asked, do you think there are any strong Democrats, excuse me. He also asked about women, but strong Democrats that will challenge Biden?
I think that there will be no major challenges if Joe Biden seeks re-election. The Democratic Party is consolidated, and they do not want a challenger to Joe Biden. Not that they necessarily like Joe Biden. They do not want Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, or any Republican to win the nomination. So you'd say, okay, who would challenge Joe Biden? Well, Ro Khanna would be the one you would probably think of. He's become kind of the descendant of the Bernie Sanders bloodline. He says he will not run. Members of the Congressional Black Caucus, members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and Congressional Hispanic Caucus have all consolidated and said that they would support Joe Biden. Moderates have said that. Governor Cooper of North Carolina has said that. Conservatives have said that. So if there were to be some sort of a challenge from the left for Joe Biden, I think they would get very little support because the party is so consolidated right now, and they want to defeat. They're afraid of Donald Trump. They're trepidatious of anybody Republican, and they just want to win this time around. And I don't think they'll let any major candidate essentially garner that much traction.
Right, and right now, if it works, don't fix it. Things are going pretty well. They've had some wins, and whenever you get anyone else, there are unidentifiable variables that you have to worry about. Whereas you have Joe Biden. It may not be perfect, but you know what you have. There are no surprises.
It's interesting. You talk about a primary challenge to the president. So go back 1968, Lyndon Johnson, Eugene McCarthy challenges him. That year, the party was fed up with Lyndon Johnson because of his prosecution of the Vietnam War. They had an issue to run against him on. So Eugene McCarthy gets in there, and that's his paramount or flagship issue. He ends up winning 42% in New Hampshire. Johnson drops out of the race. 1976. On the Republican side, Gerald Ford, it's interesting. Gerald Ford Remember Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Soviet dissident?
Yeah.
He came to the United States on a book tour, and he wanted to meet with Gerald Ford, and Gerald Ford did not want to meet with him, in part because he thought it would not be part of, quote unquote, the spirit of détente, relaxation of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. Ronald Reagan hears about this. Ronald Reagan is very much an anti-Soviet Union Cold Warrior, and says, well, I bet I'm going to have to run. So he gets into the race after that, and basically, and then he has other issues too. The Panama Canal Treaty, which Ford supported, he said, we bought it. Essentially, it's ours. We're going to keep it. And he said that Gerald Ford had essentially his budgets were too big, even though he had vetoed 66 pieces of legislation. He gets in the race, and he almost beats them. 1980, Jimmy Carter is extremely unpopular, and this is why Jimmy Carter had challengers. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party never accepted him as one of their own. He was a moderate governor of Georgia. He got in office, and the first thing he did, he tried to cut water projects that the Democrats had been trying to get through Congress since Lyndon Johnson. He wanted to balance the federal budget, whereas the liberal wing of the Democratic Party wanted more Great Society programs. So in 1979, two candidates, Jerry Brown, governor of California, and Ted Kennedy, senator from Massachusetts, and also Cliff Finch for a while, the governor of Mississippi, but he ended up losing after doing poorly in Arkansas, all ran against him. But Carter was also very unpopular in the country. The Iranian hostage crisis brought kind of a come-to-Jesus moment for the American people, though, and there was a rally around the flag effect, and that's how Carter was able to upend both of them. 1992, the last one, George H.W. Bush had an opponent in Pat Buchanan, as was aforementioned, and that was partly because Bush had made a promise when he ran in 1988. He said, read my lips, no new taxes. They negotiated with the Democrats and agreed to raise taxes in return for spending cuts. And Pat Buchanan kind of made that his flagship issue that year. But generally speaking, if a president is over 50%, or if they have consolidation within their own party and there's no real grievances within this, generally speaking, that president, like Barack Obama did, like Bill Clinton did, like George W. Bush did, are able to void off some sort of at least a major challenge.
This is another subject where Kevin McCarthy.
Oh, yes.
He's had to make some promises to some folks for some votes, including the Marjorie Taylor Greene thing. Mm-hmm. What do you suppose? What is your guess as to what he promised her besides committee appointments? Anything like? Do you think he promised no funding for Ukraine?
I can't imagine that. No, I can't imagine that he would do something. Perhaps a limited funding, but I don't think he would necessarily say absolutely no funding. We're going to cut the whole thing off today.
That's what she wants.
Yeah, that's where the left and the right kind of meet, by the way, because 31 progressive Democrats all signed a letter to Joe Biden, which was generally retracted, basically saying the same thing, that we need to stop funding Ukraine. So this is where Ralph Nader's Mercedes jams right into Pat Buchanan's Mercedes jams right in to Ralph Nader's bicycle. Boom. This is where, how do you do this? Is where right and left, the right and the left are both against funding. But no, my guess is it's more a committee. It's more, no, I mean, I don't think she's going to get a committee chairmanship or a subcommittee chairmanship just from a public relations standpoint. But she supported him from the beginning, because there's been an opponent, Andy Briggs, congressman from Arizona, who tried to run against him. And she said, no, she said, I'm for Kevin McCarthy. Now, partly also, Kevin McCarthy has done a lot to try to legitimize her. When he went down to the border, for example, last summer, Marjorie Taylor Greene was literally standing there right behind him. Okay, so a lot of it is the fact that he's tried to legitimize Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I think that's part of it. But it's interesting with Kevin McCarthy generally. Some folks like Ralph Norman from South Carolina, for example, have not gone on to his reservation yet, and you need 218 votes to become Speaker of the House, and he does not have that. There is one possible scenario. I don't think this is realistic, but so let's say the Democrats unify on somebody like, let's say, a conservative Democrat like Jared Golden from Maine. Then they get 10 Republicans to vote with them as well for that speaker. Theoretically, they could get to 218 votes that way. Or moderate Republicans could put someone up like Dan Bacon from Nebraska, for example, and get 10 Republicans to vote for him, and then get every Democrat virtually to vote for them. Theoretically, you could have a challenge that way, but I don't see otherwise how there would be a challenge to Kevin McCarthy.
Elizabeth Warren, people float her name, but if we go back to your theory about how inside experience hurts you and academic, the perception of being from academia also can hurt you, what chance does she have?
Well, she actually tried, and she tried this in her Senate race, her re-election race to the Senate, and her presidential race. She didn't emphasize teaching at Harvard. She emphasized the fact that when she did teach, she was the only professor at the law school who did not have an Ivy League degree.
I see.
And she emphasized her growing up in rural Oklahoma. That was essentially one of the flagship issues of her campaign. She's very similar to John Edwards, talked about how his father worked in a mill all his life. She tried to run as a populist. I think that if you look at her last campaign, though, in the state of Massachusetts, her home state, she came in third place. Joe Biden won the state of Massachusetts without even campaigning there, and Bernie Sanders came ahead of her. Right. So she has a problem garnering support generally, and I think that she very much underperformed last time. The other problem she has is she's up for re-election next time around. So my guess is, I mean, theoretically, she could run for both. She could start running for president and then fail and then decide to run for re-election. But my guess is that her emphasis is going to be as kind of a dissident Democrat. It's particularly dissident in terms of Joe Biden and the Federal Reserve, Joe Biden and some of his more conservative efforts to balance the budget, certainly efforts to curb inflation. My guess is she'll stay in the Senate and run for re-election.
So if Trump is the nominee, somebody will have to go up against him in debates. Do you think that the politeness of a debate is gone now? Can you compete with Donald Trump and remain civil, or do you have to play Donald Trump's game and put on the gloves and be mean?
That's a great question. I think theoretically, the way you can play civil is as soon as Donald Trump tries to essentially hit down, you just say something to the effect of, there you go again, or something like, or this is exactly why Americans don't trust politics, or Donald, this is exactly why you've never won a majority of the popular vote, and then go on and try to kind of disincline from what they're said, and just frame the issue essentially in another way, divert, and immediately try to talk about your own issues. That's the way essentially you could do it. And if let's say seven candidates in the debate are doing that, just like they did last time with Donald Trump, let's say one candidate just gets in there and says, we really need to start talking about the issues here right now. And, this is ridiculous. And the American people, this is why the American people don't like politics, something like that. Gets a big round of applause. That's how you do it.
Isn't Trump vulnerable in a primary because his competitors can point to, you're a loser. You lost this time, and this time. And after a while, people are going to go, yeah, he does lose a lot. We need to try something else. How much of a factor is his record of loss?
I don't think it's going to be as much of a factor because, first of all, Donald Trump is very much for one group in the Republican Party. There is nobody that they're going to go for. They will be with him till the last dog dies, and I think that's about 43% of the party. Now, Donald Trump's arguments, he's going to say that I really won both elections. He's going to say I won in 2016, and I won places like Erie County, Pennsylvania, that the Democrats always win. He's going to say, why did I win Wisconsin? Why did I win Ohio? I won Michigan. I won these states that Obama won, that Bill Clinton won. In some cases, even Al Gore won in 2000. He's going to say, I won in 2000, but they stole it from me. And then he's going to say that the reason we lost in the midterm, the reason we did not get control of the House and the Senate is that the candidates were not as full throttle for Trump and for the Donald Trump agenda. So that's what his essential argument is going to be. And my guess is
in the midterm that they were not full throttle enough. Trump.
That's what he says about the candidate, for example, in Colorado, who tried to distance himself from Trump. He says the reason he lost was because he tried to distance himself. And Dan Bullock, who ran New Hampshire against Maggie Hassan,
he flipped
the day after he won the primary. He said, essentially, I've talked to Democrats, independents, and Republicans, and they've all told me essentially that that the election was very much fair, and I now believe that. And Donald Trump is going to make the case that the election that Bullock would have essentially won had he stuck to his primary message. So that's how Donald Trump is going to try to maneuver. But he's going to say, I've won all these elections, and we should have won the last election.
You think that Donald Trump will give the Republicans their best chance against Biden?
No, not necessarily. No, I think that he's somebody who right now has a base, and he can't get over that base. It's a Donald Trump base, but he seems to have a ceiling. For one thing,
of course.
He's never won 50% of the vote anywhere. He's never won a majority of the vote. Now, there are people, as I say, who are for there's no God but Donald Trump. They will absolutely die for him. The problem for Donald Trump, from a mathematical standpoint,
Not quite enough of those.
That's not 50% of the vote.
Right.
And now there is one possible scenario. What if somebody else, it appears, is going to win the nomination? Donald Trump, theoretically, because he's never really been a Republican, he could run as an independent, which is probably the worst possible nightmare for that Republican candidate. He gets in there, and then he siphons off votes from the Republican, and theoretically either goes to the Electoral College or allows the Democrat to get 270 electoral votes somehow. But I just don't see a scenario where he is necessarily their strongest candidate, because to be a strong candidate, you have to be able to appeal to a wide cross section of constituencies. And he certainly appeals to what is now the conservative base. He has a lot of appeal to blue collar voters. But in terms of, for example, suburban women, in terms of places like Marietta, Georgia, where Republicans have always won, where Newt Gingrich represented, for example, places like that are very much becoming anti-Trump citadels and they are moderate conservative voters who do not like Donald Trump.
Now, a lot can happen between now and then, obviously. And what I see is Trump's star dimming pretty quickly. And things like that tend to, there's a momentum. There's a momentum on the way up. Oh, rising star. And it feeds itself. Then there's the momentum on the way down, also feeds itself. And especially when you have Rupert Murdoch and other Republicans coming out after him, he's just going to continue to get in trouble. I don't see things getting any better for him.
Yeah, and the Rupert Murdoch thing, I think, was probably a little too inside baseball. I don't think rank and file Republican voters care what Rupert Murdoch thinks, and he can make the case. He can just say these are a bunch of elitists. He did this last time, by the way, in 2016. He would give his speeches and he would go after folks like George Will, it's kind of conservative, and call them idiots and everything else. But Rupert Murdoch, and he's just going to say these are a bunch of elites that don't like me, and they're all part of the corporate media or something.
But didn't
like
Fox make him?
I think there were a lot of other news. It wasn't only Fox. There was a lot of other conservative outlets as well. And he's sometimes been critical of Fox News, frankly. But right now he doesn't only go on Fox. He goes on a lot of conservative outlets, frankly, that a lot of people have never even heard of, at least in the kind of the mainstream of America. But he'll go on shows like Hugh Hewitt. He'll go on a lot of other types of shows. But I think that generally speaking, he's a populist. His appeal is very much populist right now. And this is where he's basically run as somebody who's anti-establishment. And they view people who are even very critical of other Republicans. A lot of people who are very critical of George W. Bush, when they say George W. Bush, they say Iraq war was a disaster. There were no weapons of mass destruction. You say this, you talk about any other Republican, they're all part of the corporate media. They're part of kind of, these corporate politicians, Democrats and Republicans, but they say Donald Trump, they like him because he's somebody that's different and he's the only person who is an outsider. So as a result, he gets a lot of support from kind of those who are just so disenchanted with the body politic.
Well, look, we've been doing this almost 40 minutes. I guess we should leave something for next time. I got to go clean the house too. So thank you very much. Rich, what do you have coming up? You doing any speaking engagements? By the way,
yes,
Rich is available for speaking engagements. He does one or two of them a week. He'd be a great speaker for your organization. What do you got coming up?
Yep, I got a couple. I do. I'm actually doing a radio show right after this with Ryan Recker out in Milwaukee, where the Republican convention will be next year in 2024. But I have one over in Newton at a senior center, and I go to the Commons sometimes over in Framingham, Mass. And I'm going to be talking about, which actually be a great topic, presidents and vice presidents that don't get along.
Oh yeah, so we talked about doing something like that.
Yeah.
When it comes to Aaron Burr, I recently saw a special on Aaron Burr. Can we focus on Aaron Burr, because people don't know much about him, but he did a lot of good things, but people hated him. Like really despised him, and they call him the first modern politician, and I guess that must be because he was the first one to do certain things that are unpopular.
Yeah, this would be a great topic, and certainly the way he got elected. I'll save us a lot for next time. But the way he got elected vice president in 1800 is because back then, before the 12th Amendment, whoever came in first place was president. Whoever came in second place would be vice president. So they didn't necessarily run as a team. So Jefferson becomes president, and then Aaron Burr becomes vice president, and then in the second term, and by the way, I'll just leave you with this: George Clinton, who was the longest-serving governor in American history until Terry Branstad of Iowa came along, former governor of New York, He became the vice presidential candidate for Thomas Jefferson the first time that they allowed they allowed the president and vice president to be voted for separately. And Jefferson wanted him to be the vice president because he thought he wanted James Madison, as Secretary of State, to succeed him for president in 1808. He thought, George Clinton, he's 69 years old. We should get this guy as vice president. There's no way he would possibly challenge James Madison in 1808. And you know what happens? George Clinton becomes vice president. You know what he does? He challenges him for president in 1808, and he loses. Then he runs again for vice president. He wins, and then he becomes a thorn on the side of James Madison as vice president, breaking tie votes the other way. So this would be very much an opportune topic.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And before I say bye to Rich, folks, if you share this, it would help us both. If you want to support us, either or both of us, share to. If you want to take the time to share to big groups, like join a couple big political groups that are out there on Facebook and share this, that is a giant help. Also, I have a YouTube travel channel that I'd love you to subscribe to, Bradley J Travel. Just search YouTube for that. And that's it for today. Thank you so much, Rich. It's a great show, as always.
Thank you. I greatly enjoyed it, Bradley. Can't wait till next time.
All right. Bye, all.